time. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for the presentation just to try and walk through a few points that I want to make, and I'll try and adjust. I recognize a number of names on the screen, and I think you all have some experience, so I don't want to pitch this too low, but I do want to make sure that I'm clear about what I want to talk about. So the agenda that I have for the presentation component is just first to articulate for you how I'm using the word assessment, and for those of you familiar with traditional classroom practices, there won't be anything surprising there. I then want to move to just talk about some of the options, some of the possibilities or things we need to consider when assessing P4C. And all that should lead up then, I think, to two alternative ways of thinking about assessment that I want to offer and that I hope we can discuss. So it's really more just about thinking together at that point. So in terms of the basics, assessment, hopefully you can see this little graphic here. Assessment to me, and this is the way we introduce it to our teacher education students and the way we talk about this in institutional classroom practices, is it's a process of information gathering, right? So when we design and curate and execute educational engagements, we need to gather some information to figure out whether good stuff is happening or not. And we have different kinds of assessments or ways of gathering that information that can be helpful to us. We gather diagnostic information at the beginning of an educational sequence to understand where our students are, what kinds of background knowledge they bring, what kinds of skills they bring to the engagement. Throughout an educational engagement, we gather formative data that helps us to tweak and adjust the engagement in order to make it successful. And then we're all, of course, quite familiar with summative assessment, which is usually a test or some essay or some project, some assessment task that we're asked to complete that usually provides information which allows us to understand where the educational engagement or where the participants are in relation to some goal or some standard. And I think, it's important for us to remember that in this graphic here, the start line and the finish line aren't objective. They don't really measure. There's no, right? Standards are arbitrary. We place them to guide our work, but the educational and learning experience continues on beyond those. I think it's also really important to point out that the start point, the place where we do some diagnostic assessment, marks the beginning of an educational engagement, but doesn't tell us where the students are. And if we don't engage in some diagnostic assessment, we're not going to capture, say, situations like we see in the graphic here. This individual in blue at the start of the educational engagement is probably starting a few steps behind the others, whereas the individual in green has started a few steps ahead. Now, if we didn't diagnostically assess them and just summatively assess them at the end, green might get a better grade, right? Or appear as if they learned more, when in reality, they've learned less or they've made less progress. So all of these forms of assessment become quite important for us. What we gather in terms of information is also, there are traditional forms of that, which are often quantitative. I think in philosophy for children, we need to be more informed and think more deeply about what do we think we're doing in these philosophical engagements and what's the kind of information that we're interested in gathering. So for example, this small green self-trust is an aspect of autonomy that's drawn from feminist conceptions of relational autonomy that would be an important feature that we'd want to gather some information on. So there's lots of decisions and debate in this area, but for me, assessment is still, importantly, just about gathering information to figure out whether good stuff is happening. Assessment often gets confused with evaluation, and I'm not interested in evaluation. Evaluation is making a value judgment about where people land in this process, and I don't see it as important for educational work, although I do, but assessment work I do see as central to our educational endeavors. So there's a bit of a baseline. Hopefully that's clear enough and not too basic for everybody. But I think these kinds of standard practices then make sense in philosophy for children context, right? There is information we want to gather. We want to know what's going on. And we typically want to know what's going on. And the way that we've talked about it in philosophy for children is in terms of 3 points of reference: the group, the facilitator, and the individual student. And I think part of what I want to make is maybe the strongest claim I'll make here is that each of these matter, and we need to assess them all because of the simple fact that dialogic philosophical engagements, their educational power rests in them being different. Part of it rests in them being different from other kinds of educational engagements. And if we're not collecting information to reinforce to us that it's still different, we're missing the educational opportunity of those. We also frame educationally the community of inquiry as the educational context, right? It's the place where educational work is done and where growth happens. And so we need to collect information at the group level to understand that. And within the research and within the pedagogical literature, we see people talking about process and product of the group's work. And I think there are tools to help us look at that. But I think collecting information about both of those ends up being quite important. How is the group interacting together? How is the facilitator interacting with the group? But also, what's coming from this work together? You know, what are the new perspectives, new understandings, new theories being generated? We're typically doing philosophy for children in schools, and you know, you can't do, sorry, I just moved this on accident. You can't do work in schools without also being able to talk about individual students, and individual students and participants matter to us as well. We think that by engaging in these philosophical works or these processes, that individuals will internalize certain kinds of ways of being, skills, dispositions that they can apply in their life outside of the community of inquiry. So we should collect some information on that. I think that, you know, the way that we've talked about it, when I say we, sometimes I'm going to mean the tradition that I come from, which is the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children. We in that group have often tried to capture cognitive dimensions of inquiry and social dimensions of inquiry, both as a group and within the individual. And there are different tools for us to capture that, both outside of philosophy for children, some of those are listed here, and then within philosophy for children. I think the other thing that's quite unique, and probably more so in philosophical engagements than, say, our more traditional non-dialogic engagements, is we need information about the facilitator and what she's doing. The facilitator is understood and assumed to be central to the functioning of the community of inquiry, especially when that community is novice or hasn't internalized the disciplines of practice that are necessary for it to be productive. So we've got to collect some information about the facilitator. She has to understand whether she's doing good stuff and how the stuff she's doing is impacting the group. I'm going to suggest that best practice, or good, not best, but good practice in philosophy for children then is going to, at least in terms of assessment, is going to involve rubrics. I think because what we do is so complex, it's useful, or most useful for us to use things that can map out for us a progression or a trajectory of non-dialogic to more dialogic practice. And so this example is from the argument rating tool from Ian Wilkinson and Alina Resnitskaya, which attempts to kind of show us what teacher facilitation moves look like across a progression from less dialogic to more dialogic, or more conducive to activating the feature of dialogue, which is important, right? One of our fundamental assumptions in these inquiry-based practices is we should be discussing alternatives, confronting them, challenging them, interrogating them. And so we need to know what that looks like, and we need to know where we could go wrong, and we need to be able to know what it looks like when it's going wrong as well, both for us, and so in terms of the teacher, the facilitator, and the students. Luckily, again, those tools are out there, they're available to us, and I think a number of people have really started to develop these, and there are plenty of options for us. I want to suggest, though, and this is maybe where we can talk further once the presentation is over, that we think of assessment in two different ways. The first way I'm going to suggest is, rather than to think of assessment as assessment of instruction, I'd like us to think about assessment in philosophy for children as assessment as instruction. And that means we need to adjust our practice in terms of the use of some assessment tools differently. So my suggestion is, and I'll try and give a rationale for this, is that we don't do what we see or what's been done to us in more traditional non-dialogic teaching engagements. Oftentimes what we see when we're introduced to new phenomena, new educational curriculum, new practices, new skills, we're given terminology up front, right? So a teacher might give us a list of terms that we need to understand, let us practice and define those a little bit, and then we're given an opportunity to apply those. I think in some cases that might be appropriate, but in philosophy for children, I think it's a mistake. One, because philosophical terminology and philosophical process are so foreign to a novice that even introducing the terms and then saying try it out is already raising the bar too high. So I think what's more appropriate then is to ensure that an early engagement is philosophical. So the facilitator needs to be quite strong early in the practice, and maybe even needs to offer the philosophical question that situates the discussion, and then let the group engage in the discussion first. This means that they get an experience of the philosophical process. They feel it, they see it, and they generate examples that they can refer to. So we give them a bit of a background experience with it. Then we introduce something like this tool from the IAPC's Practitioner Handbook as a lens for the group to make sense of what they just did. So rather than front loading the terminology, we give them a lens and we talk through the use of the lens to make sense of the things they said, did, and thought. The other reason I'm suggesting this is important in philosophy for children is because this is more consistent with the deeper pedagogical commitments, which is to put the work of the students and the students themselves at the front of the priority and puts the teacher in the background again. So we want to engage in all of our practices in ways which are consistent and which line up, to keep from confusing the students, because the minute we start doing things that look like traditional non-dialogic practice, the students will shift their own understanding over to what they're more familiar with. This also reinforces the possibility and opportunity for students to be metacognitive. So in introducing assessment tools this way, we're actually introducing new practices and new ways for them to make sense of their work. So that's assessment as instruction, and I think, to me, that's a little controversial for some people, because I think there are individuals who want to say in philosophy for children, there's no room for instruction. There's no room for direct instruction. I see this as a form of direct instruction, which is still consistent with the principles and commitments. The other thing that might seem a little radical here, I don't know, it depends on how you've all been thinking about your own practice, is I'm suggesting that there's an extra realm of assessment or scope of assessment that we need to make part of our practice. And that's to gather information about the context surrounding the sessions. So we tend to, in the literature and even in the research around dialogic engagements, including philosophical ones, stop at the group, right? So we think about individual participants, we expand to consideration of the group, and we fail to recognize that the very classroom, the school, the culture of what's going on around before a philosophy session and after a philosophy session has some bearing on the way we think and engage together. And that if it's accurate to say that modern school institutions, especially those, and when I talk about school, I can only really refer now to Western European, Anglo-American models of schooling, those buildings and those institutions are designed with certain kinds of educational, instructional engagements in mind. And so their very physical structure, their political structure, their cultural structure reinforces those kinds of instructional engagements. And so we need to think more about how do we create context for philosophy to happen beyond the session itself. And so I'm thinking about, adopting new routines, funny ways of talking about things, putting different things on the wall, and ensuring and collecting information on my relationship to the students outside of my philosophical engagements to help them feel safe and to understand that this is also a space for inquiry. There's less in the literature to make sense of this. It's an emerging space. I myself have been exploring philosophical psychology and concepts like distributed cognition to begin to make some sense of this, and also social cognition to make some sense of this. And I'm increasingly convinced these kinds of things matter, but that just might be because I'm kind of nerding out about it these days. So I think that's where I want to stop the presentation component. There's a lot that's been covered there. I'm happy to revisit anything, but I'm also excited to hear your own thoughts. So I'll stop the presentation there.